You want an electrolyzer that runs constantly, which is particularly attractive for solid oxide, but you do need very high temperatures. But certainly that is something that's of interest. I know in the United States, it's also of interest, certainly in France, that potentially some of the hydrogen that's needed is going to come from nuclear sources. The last one is continued technology innovation. And here I'm not really talking necessarily about the small modular reactors or the fusion, but that is part of it. But it's also the continual innovation of nuclear technology that's happening all the time. And one aspect of this has also been the construction of plants in, say, particularly the Korean EPCs have been really strong at this. So they've been able to lower the cost in Korea. They've been able to scale up more effectively. They've done that in the United Arab Emirates. So although we see that, to be fair, the European nuclear plant constructors, the EPCs, are generally plagued by relatively high costs. Globally, some of the other companies have been able to achieve much lower costs through innovation. So that's also something that's sort of really driving the interest of nuclear. Hotspots for nuclear power. So this is from our PowerGen data platform. So this just gives people an idea what the dependence of nuclear power is for different countries. So you'll see there's an awful lot of countries that obviously have no nuclear power, so they sit in the black. All the grey ones are ones that we haven't done forecasts for, but very few of those have nuclear either. You've then got the ones that sort of sit in the blues and lilacs. So you start getting up to places like the US, which is now around under 15% of power comes from nuclear, but it's still a big baseload supply. And you've also got Russia sitting in the 20 to 25% mark. Where it gets particularly interesting, I think, is Europe. So if you start looking at Europe, you have got European countries where nuclear is quite significant. So it is still a significant baseload provider in the UK. It's very significant in Finland and Sweden. It's very significant in parts of Eastern Europe, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But certainly there are markets where nuclear is the number one power source, and it therefore makes it a very important one for the future. A little bit on the numbers in terms of where nuclear fits into global power generation investment. So global power generation investment for the next 12 years is going to be 13.3 trillion. It is a phenomenal number. We generally see around $1 trillion a year going into power generation investment overall. Now, nuclear is a relatively small portion of that, because as you can see from the data cube here, you've got huge amounts unsurprisingly, going into solar. Solar is about 50% of global investment. And you've then got onshore and offshore wind, which is about 30% of global investment. So essentially, pretty much 80 some percent of global investment is going into these forms of energy. But nuclear accounts only for 5%, but that's still 675 billion that's going to be invested. And this is in new plants, by the way. So the amount of money that goes into life extensions or long-term service, long-term operations, things like this is significantly higher. So we can see that we've got really substantial investment still in nuclear, even though it's a smaller part of the overall mix. Some idea where the additions are, and this is where I'm also going to invite Manoj to offer a few comments as well for any of the markets that he knows particularly well. You will see China is the number one. So we have huge amounts of installations going on in China year on year, and we really see that stepping up in the longer term. So things slowed in China back in sort of after Fukushima. Some of the approvals went down, but we've really seen a renewed interest in nuclear. And you can see there's a few peaks in the coming years. There's a little bit of a slowdown, but then it's a consistently higher number of potential projects. And we could see higher than this. China is probably the market that I think you could even see vastly more nuclear power accelerating. Manoj, do you want to comment? There's plenty to pick at here. So would you like to comment on a couple of these markets? Anything you'd like to offer?
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, of course. As you mentioned, China is one of the largest markets and will remain so for the next decade and a half. So they have a long term building plan for nuclear power plants, mainly because of their efforts to reduce their carbon emissions. In case that their dependency on coal reduces over the next decade and a half, nuclear will form a large part of the energy mix. And China will continue to keep on building over the next decade and a half. Same can be said for developing world, mainly Asian region, mainly if you say South Asia or Southeast Asia and the Middle East. But these countries are trying to reduce their carbon emissions and mainly to hit their carbon zero carbon emissions goal. One of the ways they are doing it is moving towards renewables, but the other also is the way to do it is to move towards nuclear power plants. India and South Asia and Bangladesh in particular is moving towards new nuclear power plants, which will come over the next 10 to 15 years. These countries are trying to gain technology as well as access to fuel from around the globe in order to set up new power plants and upgrade existing ones so that they can increase nuclear as part of their power mix. So that is always there. One of the things that I would like to point out is Middle East is a new market. Their concern is the increasing use of oil and gas in their own power mix. So they would like to reduce that and move to more nuclear power stations, mainly the names of Egypt or UAE. And new power plants are expected to come up. And in the future, you will see Middle East be a long market where they will build even larger power plants, including North African region. If you were to see the developed world, I would still say Europe and North America. Europe, in particular, will see new power plants, especially in France, but it will take some time. The next generation ones do take time to build out. So you will see some development in the developed world also. So if I have to give a ballpark figure, I would say mainly developing world will lead with Asia being number one. You will see Europe and a little bit of activity in Russia also, where they replace their older power plants. And US, you will see smaller modular reactors. We will get to that over the course of this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, interesting one. I think our forecasts here are largely on the conventional side. I think, yeah, the smaller modular one we'd have to discuss. One you didn't mention is Saudi Arabia. That's been talked about for a long time. There's been proposals kicking around now for, I would say, 6 years. Any thoughts on whether that could finally go ahead?
Saudi Arabia has an already installed base of oil-based supply. I think they will have few more discussions before they settle on which type of reactor they want to go forth, because majority of the market is still dominated by pressurized heavy water reactors, and large part of it is Russian supply over here. So the advanced Western supply, they'll still have to look around whether they go in for that. So the discussion will be around technology and what technology they adopt, if at all they go forth. Still it's on the paper, so to speak, and in Saudi Arabia still there's a lot of oil that goes into the system. So being the price front, Saudi Arabia will move forward, but not as much as its neighbors, for example an Egypt or Jordan or a UAE. So they will be still on paper for a while before they choose which country to go ahead with. It's also a geopolitical issue for them to invest so much in a particular country and a particular technology. So there will be a little bit of carefulness, so to speak, in order to move forth.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. It's something that we talked about as a trend for a while. It's something that's outlined, but it certainly seems to
Yeah.
take time. For East Asia, we've seen a bit of a change in policy with East Asia. We've seen South Korea was going to close all its reactors, and now it's turned around on that. Taiwan remains committed to closing them, and Japan is reopening some as far as we see it. Any other comments? I mean, do you see the potential for? Well, I mean, here we seem to have fairly modest forecasts, but it looks like we have got some new construction in this region.
Yes, East Asia is interesting in the sense that this all started with the war in Ukraine. Most of East Asian capacity was being turned over to gas and other critical power sources like fuel cell utility power plants that were being talked about, especially in South Korean region. Suddenly, their dependence on coal went up after the Ukraine invasion, and the cost of coal power just shot up for them. For example, the cost of coal went from say $120 to $420 during the Ukraine invasion time. So most of these countries were still dependent on coal, and they were planning to gradually phase out coal. They also have a very stringent environmental emission norm, so they had to maintain both. So on the table, they had to one hand remove coal, which seems difficult for them because their economies are heavily dependent on coal for utility power generation, and coal price is being affected by these geopolitical issues. The other one being they're slowly moving towards thinking of reopening the nuclear reactors as they see that nuclear is one way to reduce their overall carbon emissions and in order to secure the energy supply. This is one of the regions why you will see a country like Taiwan even considering new nuclear power plants in the future. South Korea will build new nuclear power plants, and Japan will open its power plants or upgrade them in a slow manner. So you will see a lot of nuclear activity over here, apart from China. That is, China has its own reasons for nuclear power, but safety and security of energy supply is a key reason, and also the dependence on coal, which is drastically increasing for these countries. They want to bring it down, and for natural gas also, they do not want it to be that much dependent on the Middle East, because most of these players do get most of their natural gas from either Middle East or Australia, and a little bit from the United States. So they would like to diversify their mix, so they're keeping their options open, so to speak. So nuclear is one of them that will see an uptick in this region.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Manoj.
Thank
Sabrina,
you.
can we go to the poll question?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Jonathan. I will launch our podcast question now and looks for everyone's interaction. And our poll question is: can Frost and Sullivan be your transformation partner? You can, for example, talk to our experts to dive deeper into transformational strategies and explore specific needs within your company. You can also become a Frost growth expert in your area of specialization and share your expertise and passion with the community through our think tanks. You can also join Frost and Sullivan's Growth Council and gain access to think tanks focused on transformational growth strategies. And also you can designate your company as a company to action to increase exposure to investors, new M&A opportunities, and other growth prospects for your business. I will leave it open for a few minutes so everyone is able to answer, and thank you. Back to you, Jonathan.
Lovely. Thank you, Sabrina. I just want to spend a couple of minutes specifically on Europe. It is my home region, so to speak. And I think it's got kind of an interesting story with Europe because it really splits three ways. You have those states that remain sort of diametrically opposed to nuclear power. So Germany has closed its last units last year. Italy has a moratorium on any new construction. Austria is vehemently against it. You have those on the periphery that have just never really bothered with nuclear. You have those that are very strongly committed, and as I said, France is a very strong nuclear state. Obviously, the UK is constructing one new reactor with another expected to go ahead, potential plans for more, and a very interesting belt of Eastern European countries that I think, because of the invasion, have prioritized bringing back nuclear. So some of them, Bulgaria, Slovakia, were already, say, strong nuclear, Hungary, strong nuclear states, but certainly Poland is an example where they talked about having a nuclear plant for some time, and things hadn't really moved that far, but the invasion of Ukraine made them very more determined. So a lot of these Eastern European countries, it's a very strong area for them, and ultimately to replace their coal with nuclear is what they're looking to do, although they are boosting renewables. You then have a sort of clutch of countries in the middle where I would put, Finland, Sweden, Spain, Benelux, where they have existing plants. They're not planning to construct any more right now, but they are looking at how long they can keep those going. And certainly in the case of Spain, they're going to close them over a slightly longer time period. Belgium, they've extended the lifetime by a way. Sweden has moved back from getting rid of them to extending the lifetime. It's possible that Switzerland may decide to extend its plants. So the reality often is that when you are confronted with trying to close these plants, you are leaving yourself right now potentially an energy gap where you will need to fill it with fossil fuels if you have not developed other alternative technologies to take it forward. So a lot of countries are choosing to keep nuclear assets online, to be able to close coal, use less gas, and then gradually build up their renewable portfolio. Right. Next generation technologies. So aside from small modular reactors, which we'll talk about in a minute, there is still a focus on so-called Gen 4 technologies. So there's a number of different technologies under development for Gen 4. So you've got six basically under development now. Four of them are so-called fast neutron reactors. And these are ones that can be designated for hydrogen production. So there is an interest potentially on utilizing these, as I said, for hydrogen production. A lot of countries are not necessarily interested in this. And believe me, there's a skepticism about how the cost will work for this. But certainly there is an effort by some nations to look at the potential for this, particularly as I say, France and China sees this as a way of really guaranteeing a portion of their hydrogen production. And there are certain, benefits with these fast neutron reactors. They particularly the core life without needing to refuel, and anything that can reduce nuclear waste is quite significant. Manoj, I don't know if you want to add anything on the Gen 4 technologies at all.
Just that the sodium reactors are becoming more popular as an alternative fuel to heavy water, mainly in developed world, mainly in the US, where the Department of Energy is pushing for alternative technology, and mostly there will be different fuel sources that will come up. Very high temperature reactors will debut, but I'm not sure when there will be a cost overrun, or will they have more an overshoot of timeline, more than 2030, that is. So that is one of the things. But definitely sodium looks a very promising technology apart from molten salt reactors. We are already seeing sodium deployment in the US, and we will see more deployment around the globe as it catches up. So that is one of the most promising technologies that I see.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, it's
Thank you.
interesting to see. It's interesting to see how this goes. We talk about this for a long time, but certainly there is, and I think, as I say, China will be quite pivotal to this. I know you mentioned the US, but China's ability to move things forward and put money behind things is probably unparalleled, I would say, with anywhere else. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what China does in this space, and whether they also then in the future try and export that elsewhere. Innovations within nuclear. So this slightly steps away from just the actual capacity additions, but it's something that we've looked at before as part of advisory work that we've done. And moving aside from new investment into new plants, there's an awful lot of existing plants, and a lot of them have got a long time left to run, and quite a lot of them are now looking, particularly in the US, they were looking basically at closing these plants down. But we're now seeing much more interest in long-term operation of nuclear plants. So by that, I mean plants that can run at least 60, possibly 80, even 100 years. So the time frame for when a nuclear plant is closing down is certainly changing. And what that brings around is a lot of different investment avenues that come in. So you have your basic sort of investment that needs to happen for a life extension. But there's a lot of interest in those areas for those companies that are investing for the long term. What other things can they bring in that will help to improve the efficiency of nuclear power? So it's a lot of the things we see in other parts of the power industry. It's the deployment of self-learning technologies. It's increasing the automation, which is already high in nuclear power plants anyway. Seeing how we can basically use computer technology to support the role of humans in this. It's even got some sort of slightly further out there ideas, but nuclear Amazon, this idea that you can actually improve the supply chain for nuclear power. At the moment, it's very component intense, with lots of components being in different locations, long time to produce. This idea that maybe we can get components more quickly and easily within the industry. I mean, crikey, they're not going to turn up 5 days after you order them, so we're not implying it's anything like that. But certainly there is a bit of an effort to try and work on the sort of value chain and to see where there can be more efficiency within the operation of nuclear. Next, we're going to talk about small modular reactors. So this is This is a really interesting one. So I'm going to see if Manoj and I maybe differ on opinion. Small modular reactors have been around for a while. They are not a new concept. There's been plenty of them at very small demonstration level built before. There was a real renewed interest, I would say, around sort of 2019, 20. Rolls-Royce was a big part of this, but Bill Gates and his TerraPower company has also been sort of leading this as well. Now, of course, the question is whether this is going to be a viable technology for the future. And we have certainly seen that progress has been fairly slow, I would say, overall. So, and this is one of the reasons I think why there has been a lot of concern. This is a came out start of last year. It was a cost estimate, basically a revised cost estimate for the project in Utah. So that was where the Gates Consortium were planning to build their first project, and the cost estimations jumped up considerably. And you can see the sort of calculation there. You know, previously they were looking at $55, $58 per megawatt hour. But obviously, we've seen big inflation. Cost inflation has impacted everything. You know, the power industry is by no means exempt. We've seen it massively in offshore wind in particular. But nuclear has also been impacted as well. And a lot of that is through, you know, you can see the increases on the right-hand side, the increases in steel costs, piping costs, all of these things have basically shot up. And the challenges for nuclear is that the small modular reactors is even with the subsidies that come as part of the investment, the Inflation Reduction Act, it has made it more difficult and has been a setback for SMRs in this sense. Manoj, what's your? I've sort of teed it up a bit here with something that's a bit more negative, but what's your feel for SMRs and the way that things might develop?
Yes, Jonathan, SMRs, at least in the US, have been overpriced drastically. And most of the companies operating in the US, you mentioned TerraPower, are looking towards subsidy from the government in order to install and operate. Even NewScale has its products on paper and design approval has been there, but they are yet to deploy. So they're looking at some sort of subsidy, either from the bipartisan infrastructure law, that is one, or else the Inflation Reduction Act, whichever gives them that. And the pricing, at least in the developed world, is pretty high. So that is one thing. But you see the development in the developing world, mainly in China and Russia, where they're already operating one or two reactors, so to speak. So one of the reactors is a ship-based one in Russia, the academic Lomonosov, which helps in the Arctic region, powering the region, because a lot of natural gas power plants and other oil facilities do require external grid support power. So that is one of the reasons. So it's a 35 megawatt ship-based reactor. So that is one of the things that is already in operational. So you will see government-aided reactors already in operation in the developing world. So that is where most of the action for small modular reactors is. So America and Europe are yet to catch up. I don't think so there'll be much in Europe right now. But for the US, they'll definitely go through. I think TerraPower will go through with its facility and its new installations, but it'll take some time. It won't be by 2030. That's what they're thinking. But it will come up sooner or later. And there will be a lot of government subsidy involved in setting up the new SMR in the United States. In the developing world, so to speak, you will have East Asian countries, mainly China, pushing forward, and you will have Russia also pushing forward with the technology and deploying them, at least in remote areas where they need these small-scale facilities. So that is one of the reasons that people think that these reactors will go ahead. So there is a huge future for this, more than the long-term penetration of larger reactors. I think beyond 2030, SMRs will see a large more implementation, where you see countries like India cooling and moving forward to implementing these reactors in their own facilities. Because one is space is a constraint for large populations, countries like India and South Asia and Asia in general, and you will need power at a smaller location. So that is one of the reasons that they look forward towards deploying SMR. So you will see traction for SMR after 2030, big time.
You're more optimistic than I am, I have to say.
A little bit more. A little bit more.
Yeah, no, it's fair enough. You're here giving your opinion. I just feel that the momentum that built a few years ago is really slowed now. I mean, these are announcements that have been in
Yes.
Europe. There was an awful lot in 2023 related to trying to build the potential to build new plants. Lots of things being explored. We've got the design competition in the UK. We've got the French president announcing plans to build a reactor. We have still got things in Eastern Europe, but I've also noticed Rolls-Royce, I think, pulling back more recently on this. And I think the industry needs a few wins without question for small modular reactors. We need to see a scenario where a couple of projects can actually fully get off the ground. Because obviously they are competing against renewables. While renewables isn't necessarily base load, obviously, as we get more renewables, more integration of the grids, more energy storage, it starts to maybe hurt the use case for unproven technology. So I'm less convinced than you are, but yeah, okay.
I'm convinced more on France. So if any country in the European region which will include an SMR will be France, because they are already turning the clock back towards nuclear. So they will have more nuclear reactors in the future, is what I think. Because France energy security is crucial for them. They do not like to be dependent externally, given the recent events. So they are already planning large scale reactors. So if there's an SMR facility within Europe, France will be the first one to deploy it, so to speak. So there will be a chance for SMR. That's what I say.
Our last topic of conversation today, then, is going to be a brief coverage on nuclear fusion. So there's definitely been more interest in this in the last couple of years. I mean, nuclear fusion is a really tricky one because it's uncharitably described as the technology of tomorrow in 20 years. I think that's the phrase, something close to that. But we have seen, and I do not profess to be an expert in all of the developments in terms of the technology, but we do seem to have seen some movement. You know, the proliferation aspect is always going to be a positive in favor of this. There's certainly been plenty of innovation, but I think the big development seems to have been there's been a couple of substantial movements forward in the so-called the JET experiment in Oxford. So basically, for those of you that don't know, there is basically nuclear fusion is often a collaboration of a lot of member states coming together. And one of the aspects of this is therefore to do testing and try and push the limit. And there was a major breakthrough in 2021. There's been certainly more funding coming in, and the ITER, which has been under construction for a long time, which will really enable fusion to move forward as well, is forecast to come online next year. So if fusion can come on, it is a massive game changer because the amount of electricity that you can generate will be phenomenal. So there's a lot of interest around the world. There are certainly some prominent. It's another thing that attracts the sort of billionaires club. So the guy who runs, I forget his name now, but the guy who basically runs OpenAI is a big believer in fusion. You've certainly got people putting money in the United States behind this. So you can see here, get an idea some of the different programs that are running. Even Italy's got one running, even though it's not one for nuclear overall. Germany also has something. So countries that aren't behind nuclear are also still looking at fusion as a different subsegment, and in part because of that lack of threat over the proliferation is certainly a factor. And you can see there's a lot of organizations, particularly US focused. So we tend to see that it's not exclusively in the US, but if you look at, and these are not all the names, by the way, there are others, but the vast majority of those that have been set up, a lot of them are US based, and a lot of the funding goes to a small number of US companies. So the kind of big four, General Fusion, TAE, Tomac, and Commonwealth Fusion, are attracting 85% of the investment in 22, similar to the year before. So there's a small few that are getting a lot more investment, but the money is starting to come in, and we are seeing certainly some big developments in this space. Manoj, do you want to comment a little bit on fusion? I'll stop sharing my screen, and then we can just chat a little bit generally about it. So what comments have you got for fusion?
Fusion is a long-term bet, but I'm not so optimistic on fusion yet. So if you see, majority of the research will go into upgrading reactors or else making reactors better. There is existing technology ones. So fusion is still somewhat away from a breakthrough. Though there are a lot of companies looking at fusion, even in the Middle Eastern ones, they are looking at fusion. Several governments are interested in fusion. But as a technology that is deployable within the next 20 years, it's still far off. And the kind of investment that is required, already you see the next generation of nuclear reactors are very expensive in that sense. So if you go through that, fusion will be far more expensive to deploy on a global basis. So even though the entire the ecosystem of fusion does guarantee a lot of benefits like power and emissions, so on. Though the technology is still unproven and the cost factor being one of them, there's still hesitation towards moving towards fusion. If fusion has to go through, it has to be a consortium of kind where many countries come together and deploy. So that's how it will go through. And there will be a lot of players involved in that. That is some way off, and there needs to be an agreement between nations for fusion. So fusion is still, I'm not so optimistic on fusion, so to speak, right now.
So so summarize that part. Neither is a super optimistic on. Well, I'm probably slightly more optimistic than you are on fusion, but you seem to be more optimistic than me on small modular reactors.
Yes,
That
definitely.
seems to be roughly where we are. We do have a question that we can both try and tackle. Can you elaborate on how the differences between new traditional gigawatt plus plants, i.e., LWRs, and SMRs are currently being perceived by potential owners, regulators, and investors? So application specific, cost, safety, construction, finance risk. I mean, I'll start with this. Um, I mean, investors in general do see nuclear as a riskier place to put your money unless you have a market mechanism that supports you. So if you're in a regulated market in the US, then you can, and you can pass that investment on to ratepayers, then that's fine. If you can, in the case of the UK, ensure you get a decent minimum strike price from the government, then it would also work fine. But investors either way are looking for some kind of guarantee. So for the traditional reactors in general, they want to understand that there's going to be some degree of government support, or they want to get contracts where they can guarantee that they will not be paying over the odds for what they're doing. And how the contract is done is really important, because if we think of the Olkiluoto in Finland, which took like 20 years to come up and running. I remember when Siemens took this is going back a bit. I think it was about 2008, 2009. Siemens basically took like a 3 billion hit that wiped out like the company's entire profit, all down to that nuclear plant. So if you get it wrong, then the issue is massive. So you have a limited number of organizations that are certainly willing to take this on. For me, the SMR world is a little bit different, because I think there you are really looking at more of the Bill Gates, the innovation investors, the people who are looking for something new, who have a decent amount of effective money to put behind it, and are kind of willing to engage like that. And some of the more futuristic nuclear technologies definitely attract that category. I think it would be hard to secure a lot of private sector investment for SMRs right now. I think until there's more proven technology and there's more costings, I think unless it comes from, as I say, the sort of billionaires club, or from, maybe, I don't know, in India, there might be state utilities where the government will strategically decide. I think it will be difficult to get much on that. Manoj, you got any thoughts?
Yes, in one sense, I would say it's mostly government driven because they can take the risk. The private companies will think twice after the entire European two reactors, the Flamanville and one in Finland. So in general, you will also have to see how small modular reactors work out. So that is when things get interesting. So the cost wise, also on deployment wise, and the timeline wise, most of these reactors you did mention took 2 decades for them to deploy one in Finland. So that is also something that private companies will look, and there's a lot of risk involved with this. And most of them will look at some sort of government handholding if they want to go through this for the long period of time. So most reactors will take a long gestation period to deploy, especially the next generation ones and the newer ones. And even the older ones that they're trying to deploy will take a long time. So any company, even being a state utility, will look at some sort of a government handholding to deploy. So the risks needs to be spread between the private sector as well as the government. So there will be a risk sharing even in the developed nations, where a risk is split between the private companies as well as the government to make new projects happen and new technologies being brought online. So this is where the new infrastructure law and the other incentives to help in, especially in the US. This will be the same format even in Europe, where there will be some sort of government push along with the private sector participation, looking at the long gestation periods of these projects. And in the developing world, most of them are already led by the government, so to speak. But there will be a lot of new technologies that will be put forth, and some private sector participation, not that much, but some. So the risk involved in these reactors are large, especially for light water reactors that may be deployed. That is, if you're looking at a previous generation of light water reactors, most of them are still based on that technology being deployed globally. So that is where most of the cost is there and most of the investment is going. If you're looking at the next generation small modular reactor, it's still an upcoming technology and being driven by purely by government in this sense, and only in the US by private sector with government assistance. So you will see light water reactors still being majority of the projects, though light water SMR will also be there. So the number of light water large scale reactors is far more in construction globally than light water SMRs, so to speak. So you will have a lot of, I would say it's a split between government and private sector, both in work in tandem in to deploy this technology and spread the risk evenly across the timeline.
Yeah. Okay. I would probably largely agree with that. I think the key point is there's a limited number of companies that will get involved in this. Nuclear is a very specialized industry. It's not for the faint-hearted. You really do have to know what you're doing, but it can be a very attractive market, particularly for, if companies get it right. It's got very decent premiums on some of the core components that go in there. I always remember from when we did more work on turbines and the like, it was always a premium pricing point for a lot of those key components that go in. Okay, I think we're pretty much done. So I'd like to thank everyone who joined today. I appreciate you giving your time to listen to us. Thanks to Sabrina for hosting. Thanks to Manoj for participating, and hopefully you'll be able to join us again for. I think we've quite decided what we're going to do yet over the summer months, but I know energy storage will be coming up soon. We're also looking at the metaverse is going to come up fairly soon. But yes, we'll certainly be having another briefing in a month's time. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day. And for those of you in Europe, enjoy the football.
Thank you.